Intercepting enemy radio traffic for Bletchley Park was work that required enormous skill, experience, and also psychological endurance. Y stations were operational 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Operators normally worked 6-hour shifts, and when they changed over, they couldn't leave the radio unattended for a moment. The operator just finishing up would have to keep monitoring right up to the second where their relief took over. The work generally required intense concentration for hours on end, and they put enormous strain on the operators. During World War II, most radio messages are sent using Morse code. So letters and numbers are represented by combinations of dots and dashes, which are listened into by operators, and they translate those back into letters and write them down as they hear them. Morse code is relatively easy to understand if you're trained and you're listening in on understandable text that's recognizable words and phrases. It's much harder when what you're listening in on is complete gibberish, like in ciphered communications. According to Nigel de Grey, one of the senior Bletchley Park managers, too much emphasis cannot be placed on the need for trained Y operators because they are the first step in the ladder. At the beginning of World War II, almost all intercept operators were male, and they were mostly ex-service signallers who'd been recruited as civilians into the Y services. The first women entered work as part of setting up what are known as home defence units, or HDUs, which intercept enemy voice communications around the time of the Battle of Britain. To intercept enemy voice traffic, the Y services needed operators who were fluent in German or Italian, and an obvious pool for that was young, mostly middle or upper class women who'd spent time in those countries before the war, and they're recruited in fairly large numbers into the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and the Women's Royal Naval Service.
Where the training courses at Southmead and Wimbledon, gradually as we improved in speed, he went faster and faster, of course. And he also, I learned later, was assessing whether we had the right sort of temperaments for a job, which would mean long periods of boredom and then some periods of it fairly intense activity.
The most unconventional recruiting strategy was that of the Radio Security Service, or the RSS, because they recruited from radio amateurs belonging to the Radio Society of Great Britain. They're called Voluntary interceptors. And these could be mostly male voluntary interceptors, could be much younger or older than most service people. And they could also include people who were really excluded from any other contribution to the war effort. There is an example of one voluntary interceptor who was bedbound after being wounded in the First World War. He had his radio set up next to his bed, and he operated it using a series of levers and used a mirror to see what the dials were reading. On one occasion in the war, he was the only operator to pick up a vital message. By the end of that, according to accounts, he could barely hold his pencil, and he received a letter personally addressed to him from the Prime Minister for his achievement. It was found that most trainees simply couldn't reach the required standard in training, and those who did found a very rude shock when they arrived at operational Y stations. The speed of transmissions, the weakness of the signals they were trying to listen in on, and the overall intensity of the work were things that they simply couldn't have been prepared for in training. The interceptors weren't searching randomly. A lot of effort at Bletchley Park and in the Y services themselves went into predicting the frequencies and also the call signs used by the enemy, so they knew where the traffic was on the radio spectrum that they needed to intercept. And this was all fed to the operators, so it was very, very targeted, but that didn't work all of the time. And the operators also had to be able to use their own initiative. And this is one of the most important contributions. When transmitting Morse code, every individual has their own sort of unique signature. It's a bit like somebody's handwriting. And the operators at the Y stations learned to recognize these characteristic methods of transmission by individual enemy radio operators. They called that their Morse fist. And by recognizing the fist of a particular operator, and also through their familiarity with the way that enemy radio networks operated, the Y services were often able to seek out the important transmissions that Bletchley Park needed to receive. Radio transmitters of the time tended to wander around in frequency, so the operators would continuously be retuning their set to keep on top of the transmission, while noting down what they heard. And it's important to note that they are listening in on very weak signals amongst an enormous amount of interference. That required enormous skill. I've heard it compared to listening to a conversation at the other end of a crowded ballroom.
We had to be able to take 25 words a minute to pass. It's very difficult to print 25 words a minute. Sometimes you'd have a good signal, and then usually at the beginning and end of the day, they changed frequencies. And from being loud and clear, they became almost impossible.
There would be large amounts of what was called operator chatter on the enemy radio networks, as the different stations got in touch with each other, checked that they were ready to send and receive messages, informed each other about any problems they were having, doing that through a combination of procedural signals and also sometimes breaking into plain language, unencrypted Morse code chatter. And all of this would be logged and processed by the WISE services, and it would be a basis of intelligence in its own right through traffic analysis.
While one girl was writing down the codes, another girl was standing by as we completed messages, and we would then teleprint it to what we knew as Station X, which was Bletchley Park. It was really quite tense while you got the message down. You had no idea of how important, how urgent, or what it was about, and you never did hear.
When the enemy actually decided they were ready to send in ciphered messages, the operators would change to a different form, known as a WT red form, and take down the enciphered message as accurately as possible. Those would be the raw material arriving at Bletchley Park, going into sections like Hut 6 and Hut 8, ready to be broken by the cryptanalysts. Even then, it was normal for there to be mistakes in a message, known as garbles, and the cryptanalysts and also the translators of Bletchley Park would have to work around these gaps in a message to generate as much intelligence as possible. If they were lucky, the enemy would have a similar problem and request a retransmission of a message, and the Y services would have a second chance to intercept it. The multiple versions of a message would be combined on arrival at Bletchley Park to give the best possible version of a particular message that could go to the analyst for code breaking. The difference of a few letters could be the difference between breaking a message and it being unbroken. The work of the operators at the Y stations was a critical element of wartime intelligence and of the work of Bletchley Park. The skill of the operators in being able to translate Morse code in their heads, recognize individual enemy operators, understand the radio networks they're listening in on, and capture traffic accurately was the foundation of all of the codebreaker operations that went on here.